All right. Hello, Family Chapel. It's good to be here with you guys. Hopefully, you're doing well. Also, just greeting one another in love. But what a blessing it is to be here. Again, my name is Josh, one of the pastors here at FC. I have the great privilege of sharing God's Word with us today. We're continuing to make our way through the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, and we're actually halfway through now. Last Sunday, we finished off 1st Samuel, and today we'll be looking at 2nd Samuel. And so, yes, we're picking up today in 2nd Samuel chapter 1. But just as a quick recap, maybe you weren't here last week or maybe you forgot after a long week. But just as a quick recap, we saw at the end of 1 Samuel that the Israelites went into battle against the Philistines, right? So they're battling it out, and as you might remember, Israel gets destroyed, right? They are absolutely decimated by the Philistines. The Israelites retreat. The Philistines capture a big part of Israel, land-wise, and 3 of Saul's sons are killed in battle, and eventually Saul himself dies as well. And in our passage for today, in 2 Samuel chapter 1, David here receives news of Saul's death. He hears about the tragedy of Saul's death. He's confronted with the reality of death. Now, I'm going to make a very obvious statement here, but one thing about living in our fallen world that's marked by sin is that death is a reality, right? There's nowhere you can go to escape the reality of death. We see the effects of death in our everyday lives. And just for example, real quick, when my wife, Jen, and I, we got married, we had a unity ceremony as part of our wedding. And then, this is when most people kind of have the candles together and they unite it together and they blow out the candles to symbolize that the two becoming one, right? Other people, they pour different color sand into one jar, like two becoming one. And, we saw these things and, they're cool, but let's be real, no one keeps their candles, right? No one knows where their unity sand is after they get married, right? And so we wanted to do something a little bit different. And what we decided to do is instead of doing candles or sand, we wanted to have a unity tree. Right? Amazing idea, right? And the whole point of this tree was we were going to plant this tree and watch this tree grow alongside our marriage. Right? And the vision was, one day we're going to buy a home, plant this tree, and it's going to grow, and we're going to pluck fresh apples off of this every day, eat it on the way to work. Right? We're going to have our kids build an amazing tree house in our tree. And this tree was going to symbolize our marriage, right? Something that is strong and sturdy and life-giving and lasting. But within the first month of our marriage, our tree died, right? It just completely disintegrated, right? We went on our honeymoon for 2 weeks and we forgot, you gotta water a tree to keep it alive. So by the time we came back, and it was shriveled, it was dry, it was dead, right? No way of salvaging this tree. And I always joke to my wife, hopefully our marriage lasts better than our unity tree. But the point is that death is a reality in our fallen world, right? You can't escape it. And maybe at a more serious level, I'm sure there are many of us here in this room who wish we could say no to death, right? Maybe we have old pets that we miss, friends or family members that we wish were still here. And one day, unless Jesus comes back before then, all of us will have to answer to death. And all of us in this room will not be able to say no to death, right? Death is a reality for all of us. It touches upon everything we know and everything we love in life. And anyone who lives long enough will suffer the grief of death. Well, here in our passage, David receives news of Saul's death. A messenger from the battlefield comes running to David, and he brings news of how Israel has been defeated by the Philistines. Saul's sons are dead, and Saul himself is also dead because he has died fighting the Philistines on Mount Gilboa. David receives news of Saul's death from this messenger. Now, if you might remember from last week, we went over this very quickly, but if you might remember, in chapter 31 of 1 Samuel, we were actually told of how things unfolded. But the story that this messenger brings in 2 Samuel chapter 1 doesn't quite add up. See, he tells David that he happened to be on Mount Gilboa where the battle was happening, and he happened to find Saul badly wounded. And with chariots and horsemen quickly approaching, he tells David that Saul asks him to mercifully end his life, to which the messenger agrees to do so. But that's a really strange retelling of the story because we know from chapter 31 that Saul committed suicide to end his life. He wasn't killed by this messenger, but he killed himself. See, more likely what happens here was that this messenger was a scavenger who came onto the battlefield to pick whatever goods were left behind for himself. And so he happens to come upon the slain body of Saul, and he sees this as an opportunity to get on David's good side. And so he takes Saul's crown, and he takes Saul's royal arm bracelet, and he brings them to David along with the news of Saul's death. And he thought that David would be happy to hear this news. He thought that maybe David would handsomely reward him for bringing him Saul's crown and Saul's arm bracelet. That maybe David would invite him into his inner circle as he becomes the next king of Israel. But instead of responding with joy or gloating or maybe even breathing a sigh of relief now that his path to the throne is finally clear of Saul, David responds in a different way. David laments. We see here that David responds with grief. All right, take a closer look here in 2 Samuel chapter 1, verses 11 through 12. This is David's response to news of Saul's death. It says this: Then David took hold of his clothes and tore them, and so did all the men who were with him. And they mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and for Jonathan his son, and for the people of the Lord and for the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. See here, David grieves over the death of Saul. Now, we may look at David's response and be like, what's the big deal? Isn't that what you're supposed to do? Or we may kind of glance over his response and just kind of whatever. But we have to understand the context of the situation to see how incredible David's response actually is. Remember, Saul has made David's life a living nightmare for the past 15 years. He's been trying to kill David. And so for the past 15 years, David has been on the run from Saul. He's been hiding from cave to cave, cold, hungry, tired. For the past 15 years, he has had to leave behind his family and his friends and the comforts of home. For the past 15 years, David has had his name tarnished, his reputation trashed, as Saul has been telling everyone that David is a runaway servant who is selfishly seeking the throne for himself. And for the past year and a half, David has lived in exile among the Philistines, away from his family, away from his wife, away from the place where he wants to worship the Lord. David has lived in exile among the Philistines. See, David's life has been a living nightmare for the past 15 years, and it's all because of Saul. Now, if we found ourselves in a similar situation, and if we heard about the demise of our enemy who has made our life a living nightmare, I think most of us, if not all of us, would rejoice, right? Most of us, if not all of us, would say, good riddance. It's about time. Finally, this person got what they deserved. But David doesn't respond in that way. See, rather than rejoicing, David responds with lament. Rather than rejoicing, David responds with grief. He is devastated by the news of Saul's death. And through David's response, we see here in our passage for today what godly grief looks like. We see here in our passage for today three characteristics of godly grief, three aspects of what godly grief looks like. The first aspect of godly grief that we see here in our passage is that, number one, godly grief is emotionally honest. Godly grief is emotionally honest. When the godly grieve, they are honest with what they are feeling. And here we see David express the range of his emotions, from his anger to his shock to his sadness to his confusion. He doesn't hold back from being emotionally honest. See, as part of the grieving process, David writes this poetic eulogy. And in the first part of his eulogy, he expresses his emotions as honestly as he can. All right, take a look at 2 Samuel chapter 1, verses 19 to 21. Skip down to verse 19. We'll read verses 19 to 21. David writes this eulogy as he laments and grieves. And he writes this: Your glory, O Israel, is slain on your high places. How the mighty have fallen. Tell it not in Gath, publish it not in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised exult. You mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew or rain upon you, nor fields of offerings. For there the shield of the mighty was defiled, the shield of Saul not anointed with oil. See, here David expresses his emotions in a very honest way. Now, as it is with any translation, right, it's hard to capture the full impact of something in a different language, right? I feel that all the time when I'm watching Korean dramas with subtitles on. My Korean is terrible, so I have no idea what's going on. Like, why does this guy like this girl, and this girl like this other guy, and that guy like this girl, but this guy has cancer? Like, I don't know what's going on, right? But in a similar way, right, things get lost in translation, especially with something like poetry. But here in the Hebrew, David writes a masterpiece of a eulogy. As one commentator or Bible scholar puts it, David's pain creates one of the most sensitive and moving expressions of mourning ever penned or uttered. And through his eulogy, he expresses his emotions in a very honest way. He opens up in verse 19 to this image. The ESV translates it as, "Your glory, O Israel, is slain on your high places." Here, Israel's glory, King Saul, the one who has been chosen and anointed by God to represent his kingship and rulership over Israel and amongst the nations, the one who was to lead his people in battle, the glorious king, is dead. And David is vividly reflecting the tragic reality of Saul's death. This is not how things are supposed to happen. This is the Lord's anointed. And yet the glory of Israel is slain on the mountain heights. And here he expresses his utter shock. He can't believe this is actually happening. David then says in verse 20 of how he dreads the news of Saul's death, spreading among the Philistines. He doesn't want this news to reach the Philistine cities of Gath and Ashkelon, because he knows that when they hear that Saul is dead, they will rejoice and celebrate and dance, and that makes him sick to his stomach. He's utterly saddened of the thought of this news reaching these people. And in verse 21, David expresses his anger as he curses the mountains of Gilboa. He says, over the place where Saul's blood was spilled, he hopes that rain will never be spilled there ever again. He curses that ground and hopes that it will be a deserted wasteland. He expresses his anger here. See, David doesn't hold back in expressing the range of his emotions. He shows his shock. He shows his utter sadness. He shows his anger. Right, this is as real and as unfiltered and as raw as it gets. He is emotionally honest. And not just here in this lament, but we see David do this all the time in the many psalms that he writes in the Bible. In those psalms, he expresses his anguish, his hurt, his frustration, his confusion, his sadness, his lack of faith, his depression, his anger, his emotions. And in those psalms and in this lament, we see here that there is room to be emotionally honest. There's room to be emotionally honest. Now, I bring this up because I think a lot of times when tragedy strikes, I think the last thing we seek is to be honest. In fact, we do so many other things to avoid being honest. See, some of us, when tragedy strikes, we hold back our tears. And we say, you know what? Men are not supposed to cry, so I will not cry. All right? I'm supposed to be a strong woman and not show my emotions. And we try to push away the things that we feel. Or for some of us, we pretend like this never happened. We remain in denial. We refuse to accept the reality of what actually took place, and we make light of the situation. We try to move on with life as though it's business as usual. We try to ignore what happened in order to ignore our emotions. Now, others of us, when we respond to tragedy, we respond by reciting biblical cliches. We put on a fake smile, and we say, the joy of the Lord is my strength. Christians should never be sad, so I'm not going to be sad here. And we carry on with a fake joy on the outside, all the while neglecting our true feelings on the inside. And for others of us, the way that we respond is that we engage in destructive behavior. Instead of honestly dealing with what we're feeling inside, we vent our frustration by hurting ourselves or hurting those around us. We go binge drinking or binge eating. We veg out in front of a computer screen, or we purchase really expensive things that we cannot afford or that we don't even really need. We neglect our responsibilities. We lash out against others, or we push everyone else away. But these are all negative coping mechanisms to avoid being honest. However, godly grief is emotionally honest. And God calls us to that. See, God has given us feelings, not to push away, but he's given us feelings to feel them. That's why they're called feelings. See, as pastor and author Pete Scazzaro writes in his book, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, he writes, to feel is to be human. To minimize or deny what we feel is a distortion of what it means to be image bearers of our personal God. To the degree that we are unable to express our emotions, we remain impaired in our ability to love God, to love others, and to love ourselves well. We're called to feel. Now, this does not mean that our emotions are always right. Very often they're wrong. This does not mean that our emotions are always logical. Very often they are very illogical. But our emotions serve as indicators showing us what's really going on in our hearts. And we're not called to ignore what's going on in our hearts. Rather, we are to rightly process grief by being emotionally honest. We need to do the hard work of being honest with ourselves, of processing our thoughts, of engaging with our emotions. And this will look very different for everyone in this room, right? For some of us, we're verbal processors, so we just need to spew out everything on our hearts to someone else who will patiently listen. Others of us are silent processors, and we just need to be alone in a quiet place and just think to ourselves. For some of us, journaling or writing down our thoughts can be helpful. For others of us, having a creative outlet is really helpful. And for others of us, going on an intense workout or a hike through nature provides a lot of clarity. But whatever form it takes, we are to honestly engage with what's going on inside of our hearts. Because godly grief is emotionally honest. That's the first aspect that we see here with David. Now, a second aspect of godly grief that we see here in our passage is that number 2, godly grief gives thanks. Godly grief gives thanks. See, in the midst of the pain, godly grief is able to show gratitude. When the godly grieve, they are able to appreciate God's work of grace, even in a flawed person, even in someone like Saul. And that's what David does as he laments, right? If you continue on to the next few verses, look at verses 22 and through 26. David continues his lament, and he points out the evidences of God's grace that he sees, right? He writes this: "From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan turned not back, and the sword of Saul returned not empty. Saul and Jonathan, beloved and lovely, in life and in death, they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lions. You, daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you luxuriously in scarlet, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel. How the mighty have fallen in the midst of the battle. Jonathan lies slain on your high places. I am distressed for you, my brother, Jonathan. Very pleasant have you been to me. Your love to me was extraordinary, surpassing the love of even women." Here David remembers and he rightly honors the good that he saw in Saul and Jonathan. See, even for someone as flawed and broken and twisted and sinful as Saul was, David is still able to appreciate the markers of God's grace that he sees in his life. Right here in verse 22, David honors the military might and ability of Saul and Jonathan. He praises their courage and their ability to win battles, the victories that they have won. David also points out their loyalty and faithfulness in verse 23. Right? Even to the bitter end, even in their death, the enemy could not destroy the bond between father and son. As they stood together in life, they also remained together in death. And from there, David goes on to specifically give thanks for Saul in verse 24. He recognizes Saul's leadership. He recognizes that Saul was able to bring a measure of wealth and stability to Israel. Right? Saul had rallied a group of divided tribes into a unified nation, and Saul praises God for that. And lastly, in verse 25, David turns his attention to Jonathan, his best friend. David understood that Jonathan was the one who sacrificed the most to have David step into this role as king. Jonathan was the one who had the birthright to be the next king of Israel, but he gladly gave his birthright away in submission to God and in support of David. David recognizes that Jonathan came at the crucial and critical moments of his life to encourage him, to rescue him. And for that brotherly love, David is so thankful. See, even in the midst of pain, godly grief knows how to give thanks. Godly grief can spot the markers of God's grace. Now, let me be clear here. Giving thanks isn't to sugarcoat someone's legacy. It isn't to pretend that this person was flawless or perfect or never did anything wrong. See, David is very aware of Saul's flaws. He's lived it for the past 15 years. But to give thanks is to recognize the true presence of God's grace, even in someone who is seriously flawed and broken. And that's important to do because, you see, sometimes we allow our bitterness to get in the way of our grieving. Right? Sometimes we think that bitterness and grief are the same things. They're not. Bitterness is rooted in unresolved anger. Bitterness is rooted in is an unresolved thing. Bitterness stems from that. And so holding on to that bitterness blocks us from reaching a place of resolution. But learning to give thanks helps us to grieve properly. And it frees us to eventually heal. Right? It's kind of like this story that I heard. There was a guy whose father had passed away. And he did not have a good relationship with his dad. And so on the day of his funeral, this guy, even though his dad had passed away, this guy refused to cry. He thought that if he shed some tears, that would let his dad off the hook way too easily. See, he was holding on to years of pent-up frustration and disappointment and bitterness. And so he refused to cry on the day of his dad's funeral. And for the next 6 months, he refused to cry. He would not cry any tears, even when he was alone. He just stewed in his bitterness. Until one day, he was meeting up with an old friend, and they were just kind of hanging out, reminiscing about the old days. And his friend just kind of casually brought up a story about how his dad used to pick them up from school early. They would, ditch school early, go with the dad, and they would go fishing at a local pier nearby. And this friend especially remembered this one time when they had ditched school early to go fishing, how that day he didn't catch any fish. Right? He spent hours there trying to fish, but didn't catch anything. And so he was so sad. And so the dad gave him the fish that he caught. And that friend was just kind of reminiscing, thinking about the day, just kind of chuckling to himself, thinking back to those old days. Well, after hearing his friend share that, this guy kind of just brushed it off. Right? Just a dumb memory. Right? And the reason for that was because it did not fit with the narrative he had of his dad. See, to him, his dad was a failure. His dad was someone who drank too much, someone who gambled the family's money away, someone who was emotionally distant, someone who was lazy. And that's the picture he wanted to hold on to because that's the picture he could remain bitter with. But in hearing his friend give thanks about his dad, something began to click. See, through the brokenness of his dad, he began to see the grace and mercy of God. And little by little, memories started to come back to him. Conversations that they had, interactions that they had, inside jokes, ridiculous moments. And for the first time in 6 months, he began to cry. For the first time in 6 months, he began to grieve. And for the first time in 6 months, he began to heal. See, that was the first step to coming to a place of resolution for him. See, giving thanks in our grief, it does not take away the pain. Giving thanks in our grief doesn't magically transform a terrible person into a perfect person. It doesn't do any of those things. But giving thanks in our grief begins to cut away at the bitterness in our hearts. And giving thanks in our grief begins to make a way for healing and restoration to take place. And so as we think upon the people that we have lost, upon the broken relationships that we have, we recall the grace of God. We choose to remember the grace of God. And as we remember God's grace, we begin to give thanks. And as we begin to give thanks, we begin the process of healing. See, the godly know how to give thanks, even in a broken situation, because godly grief gives thanks. That's number 2. Lastly, the final aspect of godly grief that we see here in David is number 3. Godly grief is willing to linger. Godly grief is willing to linger. In other words, godly grief is willing to wait in the sadness. When the godly grieve, they are never in a rush. See, David ends his lament in verse 27 in kind of a surprising way. Right? In our Disney-fied culture, we're always looking for the happy ending, right? We're always looking for a neat resolution. And we may think that someone as godly as David, the Lord's anointed, a man after God's own heart, someone like David would surely be able to put a smile on his face and move on with life. But take a look at how he ends his lament. Right? Look at verse 27. He writes this: how the mighty have fallen and the weapons of war perished. That's the end of his lament. That's how it ends. There's no resolution, no happy ending, no hope for everything's going to be okay. All David can say is how the mighty have fallen. And this is the third time that David repeats this phrase in his lament. He says how the mighty have fallen in verse 19 and verse 25, and now here for the third time in verse 27. Right? It's like David is so sad and there are no adequate words to express his grief that he can only just repeat himself over and over and over again. He just ends in this way. But as we see how David ends his lament, he shows us that godly grief is willing to linger in the sadness. He's not quick to just brush off his sadness and move on. Yes, he knows that there is a lot of work to be done. Yes, he knows that the Philistines have occupied major parts of Israel. Yes, he knows that it is his job to reclaim the land back for Israel. Yes, he knows that the kingdom and the kingship, the throne is waiting for him. There is a lot of work to be done. But even with all these pressing matters surrounding him, David finds the space to linger. He waits. And that's important for us to get. I think so often, for so much of us, we can try to move on too quickly. We can be so quick to move on before we even really process and express our grief. But friends, there is no expiration date for grief, right? It's not like you can give 6 months for a breakup and you're good to go, or 2 years for losing your parents and, all right, time's up, time to move on. It doesn't work like that. And yet, how often we try to hurry ourselves along. How often we think that by a certain period of time, I should be back to normal. My life should resume as it once was. I should go back to enjoy my life. But healing takes time. Recovery takes time, and there is no way of going around the aftermath of grief. You can only go through it. There are no shortcuts. And so we learn to wait. We learn to sit with our grief, to feel its aches in the morning, to feel the weight of it at night. And for most deep-seated grief, that pain will never fully heal. It will be carried for life. And so the godly learn how to walk with a limp as they long for the day when they will see Jesus face to face. See, godly grief is willing to linger. The godly are never in a rush. And through David's lament over Saul and Jonathan, we have seen what godly grief looks like, right? We've seen that godly grief is emotionally honest. And godly grief gives thanks. And godly grief is willing to linger. And for some of you in this room, maybe you need to hear God's invitation to grieve, to process your grief in a godly way. Maybe for some of you here in this room, maybe you've been brushing off grieving because it feels too painful to open up old wounds, or because you would rather pretend like everything is okay. If that is you, would you hear God's invitation to express your emotions, to grieve before Him? And for others of us, maybe you have been grieving, but you've been grieving in an unhealthy way. You've been binge eating or binge drinking or just squandering your time in front of a computer screen. If that is you, would you not mistake your bitterness for grief? But would you rather hear God's invitation to see His grace through the brokenness? And as you give thanks, would the healing process begin? And maybe for others of us, maybe we've been so eager to rush ahead, to get on with life, to move along quickly. Would you hear God's invitation to linger, to wait, to rest? See, God invites us to grieve. But friends, know this, as we grieve, we do not grieve as those without hope. Yes, there's nothing we can do to avoid sin and death in this world. There's nothing we can do to avoid ever having to grieve ever in life. But as we grieve, we can place our hope in the one who has overcome our sin and death. As we grieve, we can look forward to the day when He will wipe away every tear. As we grieve, we can look forward to the day when death shall be no more. As we grieve, we can look forward to the day when our grief will give way to glory. So, Family Chapel, may we grieve well. May our grief be marked by a godliness. And may we grieve not as those without hope, but as those with an unshakable hope in Christ.